Welcome back, listener. Today, we're going deep on something that I find fascinating. It's how even the stealthiest cyber attacks eventually, unravel. We've got this really, really interesting incident response report. It details a Lockbit ransomware deployment. And we've also got a bunch of articles that analyze, attacker techniques and defenses. So get ready because we're going to explore why attackers try so hard to stay hidden. And we'll also look at the clever methods that they use and what ultimately trips them up.
Yeah, it really is a constant cat and mouse game. And what I think is so fascinating is that despite all their efforts to stay, invisible, attackers often leave behind traces like digital breadcrumbs that tell the story of their actions.
Okay, so let's kind of set the stage here. Why is stealth such a crucial part of cyber attacks? The advantage that attackers get by remaining, undetected.
Well, just imagine, right? Imagine an attacker who's able to basically operate under the radar. They can maintain access to a system for a really long time, potentially taking sensitive data or manipulating infrastructure. They could even be laying the groundwork for, future attacks. And they could do all of this without raising any alarms.
So it's not just about getting in, it's about staying in, right? And achieving their objectives without being noticed.
Exactly. And to do this, they use a whole range of defense evasion techniques. And these tactics are all about bypassing security measures, evading detection, and making it as hard as possible for defenders to really understand the scope and impact of the attack.
So they're trying to blend in with the noise of normal network activity.
Exactly. They want their actions to look as legitimate as possible. That attack framework, it's that knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques, right? Well, it categorizes all these methods as defense evasion, and it really helps security professionals understand and categorize these attack patterns.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what are some of the specific tactics that fall under this defense evasion umbrella?
Oh, there are so many. Attackers might obfuscate their code, right? Making it hard to analyze. They might use fileless attacks where the payloads are executed in memory and there's nothing left on the hard drive. Or they might even, hijack system tools to do stuff. And that way they're blending in with all the normal system activity.
So it's almost like a chameleon changing its colors to match the surroundings.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. But even with all of these, sophisticated evasion techniques, mistakes still happen.
And that's what this incident response report, the one about the Lockbit ransomware deployment, really highlights, right? Can you kind of walk us through what happened there? Like how, despite their attempts to be stealthy, the attackers still made some mistakes?
Yeah, absolutely. This report is such an interesting case study because it shows how even a well-planned attack can just, unravel because of seemingly small errors. In this incident, the attackers, they first got in through a Cobalt Strike beacon. This is a tool that's commonly used to establish a kind of covert foothold within a network. It allows attackers to control compromised systems remotely. Understanding those initial access tactics is just so important for defenders because it helps them anticipate and mitigate those common attack vectors.
So the attackers got in, but then how did they try to maintain a persistent presence without being detected?
Well, this is where the first mistake pops up. They used scheduled tasks and registry run keys. And those are really basic persistence techniques that are pretty easy to detect, if you know where to look. It's like leaving a spare key under the doormat. Convenient, but not very secure.
Seems kind of surprising that attackers would use such, simple techniques.
Yeah, well, sometimes attackers will, choose simplicity, especially if they think the target's defenses are weak. And this just highlights a really important challenge for defenders. How do you distinguish between those, opportunistic low-skill attacks and the more targeted and sophisticated ones? Because you need different strategies for both.
Got it. What about privilege escalation? How did they try to elevate their access without raising any red flags?
Well, here, they got a little bit more clever, but they still made a mistake that could be traced. They injected malicious code into processes like wuiuclt.exe, which is the Windows Update client. And they did this to get into the LSAS memory space.
And for those who don't know, LSAS is a super critical process in Windows. It handles authentication. So being able to access it is a big deal for attackers because it's got all those credentials that can give them broader access.
Exactly. It's clever because it lets them potentially steal credentials without actually installing any extra malware. But injecting into a common process like wuiuclt.exe, it leaves behind these artifacts that experienced investigators can find.
So even their cleverness wasn't perfect.
Right. They also used system privileges for those scheduled tasks. And that's another one of those big red flags. It's like using a bulldozer to plant a flower, right? Way too much force for something that should be subtle. They disabled Windows Defender, which is a classic move that's always suspicious. And while they used process injection, which can be stealthy, it can still be found with good security monitoring tools, the kind that can analyze unusual behavior. And then there's the lateral movement. That's how they tried to spread through the network without setting off any alarms. They used common methods like RDP, WinRM, and remote services. Now, those are legitimate tools for remote administration, but they all leave traces in the network logs.
So they were trying to blend in with the normal traffic, but they forgot to, cover their tracks.
Exactly. And get this, they even deployed tools like SystemBC and GhostSOCKS to the domain controller. Those are tools designed for lateral movement and masking activity. But they can be detected, if you're looking for the right signs. It's like disappearing in a crowd, but wearing a super bright hat.
So they were trying to be ghosts, but they left behind footprints.
Exactly. And then there's command and control, right? That's how they talk to their external infrastructure. They used Cobalt strike beacons and proxies, and those are like clues, for defenders who know what to look for. This whole report really highlights how even when attackers use sophisticated tools and techniques, they'll often make mistakes that expose them. It could be because of time pressure, maybe they don't have the resources, they lack expertise, or maybe it's just overconfidence. But these errors can really be a defender's best friend.
It's almost like they're racing against the clock and, well, their own human nature.
That's a great way to put it. And this actually leads us to the bigger topic of, attacker mistakes in general. Beyond just this case, we see these errors all the time across different attack types and different threat actors.
And this is where things get really interesting. What are some of the most common slip-ups that attackers make that blow their cover?
One that happens a lot is using poorly made payloads. Imagine an attacker, rushing to deploy malware or exploit a vulnerability. They might just use off-the-shelf tools without customizing them, which makes them super easy to spot. It's like sending a phishing email that's so generic it just gets flagged as spam.
So they're trying to cut corners?
Yeah.
Sacrificing stealth for speed?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the classic mistake of leaving artifacts behind. Log entries, files, registry keys. Those are all digital fingerprints that can help, reconstruct the attack. And even deleting those files, it doesn't always mean they're gone for good, Data recovery techniques can bring them back.
It's a good reminder that actions often leave lasting traces.
Precisely. And then there's something called operational security, or OPSEC. It's about all the everyday practices that can make or break an attack's stealthiness. And we see attackers making mistakes here all the time, like reusing passwords, using insecure communication channels, even using their personal email addresses for attacks, or connecting to public Wi-Fi during an attack. It's like a spy using their real name and address for their secret missions.
That's incredibly risky. It seems like they just completely overlook basic cybersecurity hygiene.
It happens more than you'd think. And these are the kinds of simple oversights that get attackers caught. It's amazing how even when attackers try to cover their tracks, they often leave behind these, digital footprints.
Right. In part one, we were talking about those digital breadcrumbs. Let's dive into some real-world examples of, where attackers have messed up. What are some cases that really stand out to you?
Well, the Equifax breach back in 2017, that was a big one. It really shows how a simple mistake can have, huge consequences. The attackers got in by exploiting a vulnerability in the Apache Struts framework, a web app framework. And the thing is, a patch was available, but Equifax, they just hadn't applied it.
So it's like they left the door wide open. They just assumed no one would try to use that vulnerability.
Yeah, exactly. And it was a big mistake. It resulted in this massive data breach that impacted millions of people and caused a ton of damage, both financially and to their reputation.
This really shows how important it is to keep systems patched and up to date. But sometimes, even with patches, attackers find ways in. Like with the WannaCry ransomware attack, also in 2017.
Oh yeah, WannaCry, that was a big one.
Yeah.
It spread like wildfire, impacting systems all over the world. The attackers exploited a vulnerability called Eternal Blue in the Windows operating system. And again, there was a patch available. It had been released months before.
So another attack that could have been prevented with, timely updates.
Absolutely. But so many organizations and individuals, they just hadn't patched their systems, and that made them easy targets. This really highlights the importance of patch management, making sure your systems are updated. And also just understanding that vulnerabilities are constantly changing. It's a moving target.
It's like attackers are always one step ahead, looking for that next weakness to exploit. And sometimes it's not just about technical oversights. Think about that Tesla incident in 2023, where former employees leaked data.
Yeah, that was a different kind of attack. It wasn't like traditional hackers breaking in, it was an insider threat. Those employees had legitimate access, but they misused it. They leaked a bunch of sensitive data to a foreign media outlet, and I guess they thought they wouldn't face any
So it
consequences.
was more about overconfidence and not really thinking about the seriousness of their actions.
Yeah, exactly. And that case shows how important security awareness training is. It's not just for IT staff, it's for everyone, because everyone has a part to play in keeping data safe.
So we've seen how technical mistakes and human errors can lead to these major security breaches. But why do attackers make these mistakes? What are the underlying reasons?
Well, time pressure is a big factor. Attackers are often working against the clock. They need to get in and out quickly, whether it's because of the target they're attacking or the tools they're using, or even the risk of getting caught. And that pressure can lead to rushed decisions and careless mistakes.
It's like they're always in this race against time, and that urgency can make them less precise.
Exactly. When you're rushing, you're more likely to miss important details or make errors. Another factor is resource limitations. Not every attacker has access to the latest and greatest tools or a ton of computing power. Some of them might be using old software, they have limited resources, or maybe even budget constraints.
It's like trying to compete in a high-stakes game.
Yeah.
You don't have the best equipment.
Right. And that can force them to use techniques that are less sophisticated and easier to detect. Or they might take shortcuts that leave a clearer trail. And of course, there's the issue of expertise. Not all attackers are, master hackers. Some might be pretty new to this, and they might not have the skills for more advanced attacks.
So it's like trying to do something really complicated without having the right training.
Yeah, exactly. They might make mistakes when they're trying to execute the attack, or they might have to rely on more basic techniques that are easier to defend against. And then there's overconfidence, which can be a big problem. Some attackers, they get so confident in their abilities that they start taking unnecessary risks or they underestimate their opponent.
It's like when you have a winning streak, you start to feel invincible, even though you're not.
Yeah, and that kind of thinking can be dangerous. It can make them reckless and careless about their security, and that can ultimately lead to their downfall.
It's fascinating how much psychology plays into all of this.
It really does. Attackers are human, just like everyone else. They have the same biases, the same emotions, and the same cognitive limitations. And those human elements, they have a huge impact in the world of cyber attacks.
So beyond those factors, we've talked about time pressure, limited resources, different levels of expertise, and overconfidence. Are there any other psychological or behavioral things that we should keep in mind?
Well, there's something called tunnel vision. Attackers can get so focused on one specific goal that they lose sight of everything else. They forget about the potential consequences or the possibility of getting caught. It's like focusing on one tiny piece of a puzzle without looking at the whole picture.
So they get so fixated on the immediate goal that
Yeah.
they miss the bigger context.
Exactly. And that narrow focus can cause them to overlook details that might have given them away. Then there's complacency. If they've had some success in the past, they might get a false sense of security. And that can lead to cutting corners and not being as careful. And the thing is, the world of cybersecurity is constantly changing. What worked yesterday might not work today. Attackers have to adapt and change their tactics if they want to stay ahead. And finally, we can't forget about stress and fatigue. Cyber attacks can be really demanding, mentally and emotionally. Attackers are often working long hours under a lot of pressure, and they're worried about getting caught.
It's like they're living in a constant state of high alert.
Yeah, exactly. And all that stress can lead to burnout, bad decisions, and more mistakes.
This whole discussion about the psychology and the operational side of attacker errors has been really insightful. It's amazing how even small slip-ups can completely derail an attack, even one that was planned out really carefully.
And that just highlights the fact that cybersecurity isn't just about the technology, it's also about understanding how people behave. If we can recognize those human vulnerabilities, we can get better at anticipating attacks and defending against them.
So listener, we've taken a deep dive into the world of attacker errors. We've looked at real-world examples and explored the reasons behind those blunders. Now, in part 3, we're going to shift our focus from attacker mistakes to defense strategies. We'll see how understanding those human and technical weaknesses can help defenders build systems that are more robust and resilient. Stay tuned for our final insights. Welcome back, listener. In the last couple of parts, we really dug into the minds of attackers. We looked at where they mess up and why. Now, I think it's time to flip the script and see how we can use that knowledge to our advantage. How can defenders take what we've learned about attacker behavior and, build stronger security systems?
It's about shifting our mindset. Instead of just reacting to attacks, we can try to anticipate them. If we can spot those weaknesses that attackers are likely to exploit, we can build defenses that actually use those weaknesses against them.
So it's like turning the tables, using their own tactics against them. What are some of the best ways to do that?
One strategy that's gaining popularity is deception technology. It's all about setting traps, creating a kind of controlled environment that looks like a normal part of your network, but it's actually designed to lure attackers in and, trick them.
It's like a digital honeypot, right? You put something out there that looks valuable, but it's really just a clever illusion.
Exactly. And it plays on those attacker assumptions we've been talking about. You could create a fake file server with some juicy data or a system that looks like a critical asset. And if an attacker takes the bait, well, they're there and what they're after. It gives you time to respond.
So it's a way to catch attacks that might otherwise slip through the cracks. It's like a spider web, just waiting to catch its prey.
That's a great analogy. And the best part is it gives you valuable intel. By watching how attackers interact with these decoys, you can learn their tactics, their techniques, their whole playbook. That helps you strengthen your defenses overall.
Deception technology, that's really clever. But what about limiting the damage once an attacker is already inside the network? That's where microsegmentation comes in, right?
You got it. Microsegmentation is all about breaking your network down into smaller, isolated sections. It's like building compartments that make it harder for an attacker to move around.
So even if they get into one area, they're trapped, like rats in a maze.
Exactly. And it really messes with their plans. You see, attackers rely on lateral movement to do things like escalate privileges, steal data, or spread malware. By limiting their movement, you're basically boxing them in, making them easier to spot and contain.
That's a way to minimize the impact of an attack, even if you couldn't prevent the initial breach.
Exactly. It's part of that layered security approach where you have multiple lines of defense to make things as tough as possible for the attackers.
And then there's the zero trust model, which seems to be getting a lot of attention lately. How does that fit into this proactive defense strategy?
Zero trust, it's a big change in how we think about security. It's all about never trust, always verify. You basically treat every user, every device, every connection as potentially hostile, no matter where they are or if they've been authenticated before.
So it's like having a security checkpoint at every single door,
Hmm.
constantly checking everyone's ID.
Exactly. Instead of just assuming that anyone inside the network is safe, Zero Trust says, prove it every time. You need to continuously authenticate and authorize every single request.
That makes it a lot harder for attackers to use stolen credentials or compromised systems, right? They
Yeah.
can't just move around freely anymore.
You got it. It breaks their attack chains and limits the damage they can do, even if it's an insider threat or a compromised account.
These proactive strategies like deception technology, microsegmentation, and zero trust, they're all really interesting. But technology is only part of the solution, right? We can't forget about the human factor.
Absolutely. Technology gives us the tools, but it's people who use those tools and make the decisions. That's why security awareness training is so important. Everyone needs it.
Yeah, we need to empower everyone to be part of the security team. They need to know how to spot and report suspicious activity, create strong passwords, and not fall for phishing scams or social engineering tricks.
Exactly. The more we educate and empower people, the stronger our defenses become. We need a culture of security where everyone understands their role in protecting sensitive information.
It's like building a human firewall.
That's a great way to put it. And don't forget about incident response plans. We need to have those in place and we need to test them regularly. That way, everyone knows what to do if an attack happens.
So it's about being prepared for the inevitable, having a plan for when things go wrong. We need to be ready to detect the attack, contain it, and recover.
You got it. The better prepared we are, the faster and more effectively we can respond. That way, we can minimize the damage and get back on our feet quickly.
Well, this deep dive into attacker mistakes and proactive defense has been really eye-opening. What are some key takeaways that you want our listeners to remember?
The biggest takeaway is this. Even the best attackers are human. They make mistakes, and we can use those mistakes to build better defenses.
So don't be intimidated by their skills or their fancy techniques.
Right. Another important point is that cybersecurity isn't just about technology. It's about people, processes, and culture. We need to understand how attackers think and act, and we need to adapt our defenses accordingly.
It's a team effort, a multifaceted approach.
Exactly. And lastly, I think it's crucial to stay curious and informed. The more we know about how attackers work and where they're likely to slip up, the better prepared we'll be.
Knowledge is power, especially in the world of cybersecurity.
Absolutely. By understanding the human element in cyber attacks, both the attacker's mistakes and our own vulnerabilities, we can make the digital world a safer and more resilient place.
That's a great point. Well, this has been an incredible journey into the world of attacker blunders and the strategies we can use to turn those weaknesses into our strengths. Listener, we hope this deep dive is giving you some valuable insights and a renewed appreciation for the importance of being vigilant, adapting to change, and taking a holistic approach to security. Until next time, stay curious, stay secure, and remember, even when faced with evolving threats, knowledge is our most powerful weapon.